Bones beneath the prairie. Ancient remains uncovered by cattle hooves. The prairie has always seemed endless, an ocean of grass stretching beyond the horizon. To settlers, it was both promise and peril, fertile soil for farming, yet an expanse where storms could swallow you whole. But sometimes, in the churn of hooves or the scrape of a plough, the prairie revealed things far older than cabins or cattle. Bones, massive, unearthly bones, emerged from the soil, stopping men in their tracks. These were not the skeletons of bison, which every cowboy knew well, but fragments of creatures long gone. The West was, quite literally, a graveyard. Mainstream history tells us that some of the earliest dinosaur discoveries in North America happened in these frontier lands. In the mid-19th century, near Fort Benton, Montana, bones later identified as belonging to great reptiles were uncovered by soldiers. Elsewhere, Nebraska farmers stumbled upon the tusks of mammoths, mistaking them for the remains of giant, ancient cattle. These finds often made their way east to universities, fueling a scientific rivalry later dubbed the Bone Wars, where paleontologists raced to outdo one another in naming new species. But the quirks of frontier imagination wrapped these discoveries in legend. A Kansas cowboy, upon finding a colossal rib bone, swore it belonged to a prairie dragon that once stalked the plains. In Dakota Territory, the fossilized remains of marine creatures, proof that much of the Midwest was once underwater, were sometimes interpreted as evidence of the biblical flood. Newspapers mixed fact and fancy, describing giant lizards rising from the ground as if they had only just died. For men living at the ragged edge of civilization, these bones blurred the line between science and story. Yet scholars still debate how these finds were understood at the time. Did settlers truly believe they were unearthing monsters, or did they simply lean on myth to explain the incomprehensible? Some argue that tales of thunder beasts and bone fields were exaggerations to attract attention, and perhaps even settlers, to remote areas. Others insist that native traditions, which spoke of great animals predating humans, were reinterpreted through a settler lens, creating hybrid myths that only deepened the mystery. The rabbit hole goes further. Beneath ranches and ghost towns lie layers upon layers of bones, not only prehistoric giants, but also unmarked graves of migrants, soldiers, and forgotten families. Cattle drives sometimes exposed skulls, both human and animal, scattered in the dust. In some cases, locals preserved them as curiosities, hanging them in barns or displaying them on fences like grim trophies. Each discovery was a reminder that the prairie was not empty, as maps once claimed, but filled with the remains of countless lives and countless ages. Even today, when storms erode topsoil or construction cuts into forgotten ground, bones still surface. Some belong to ancient bison hunted thousands of years ago. Others belong to horses and people whose stories were never written down. Scholars still debate whether we should treat the prairie primarily as a natural archive, a cultural graveyard, or something in between. For in these bones lies more than history. They are whispers of time itself, rising from the earth, reminding us that the ground beneath our feet holds secrets far older than the frontier. The glass desert, shimmering fields no map ever marked. The desert has always been a place of illusions. Heat ripples bend the horizon, turning sand into seas and distance into mirage. Yet scattered across the American Southwest are stranger phenomena, fields where the sand itself turns to glass. Early travellers spoke of shimmering stretches where the ground glittered like obsidian, as though fire had swept across the desert and frozen mid-flame. These glass deserts became rabbit holes of speculation, places whispered about in both scientific journals and saloon chatter. Mainstream history points to one such site near the Jornada del Muerto Basin in New Mexico, where deposits of natural desert glass were noted even before the atomic age. Some of these were formed by ancient lightning strikes, their heat fusing sand into curious shapes. Others may be remnants of prehistoric meteor impacts, scattered evidence of cosmic encounters long before wagon trains crossed the land. To settlers stumbling upon the fragments, however, they looked like relics from a firestorm that no one could remember. The quirks of frontier storytelling only deepened the mystery. Cowboys claimed their horses refused to cross these patches, hooves skittering on the sharp black shards. One traveller described finding a perfectly smooth, bowl-shaped depression lined with fused glass, as though it had been a giant's kiln. Another insisted that the fragments glowed faintly in moonlight, a detail repeated so often it became frontier folklore. Collectors sometimes carried shards as good luck charms, calling them thunderstones, believing they had fallen straight from the sky. And yet, scholars still debate the origins of these glassy fields. Some argue they are evidence of ancient meteor strikes, citing parallels to Libyan desert glass in North Africa. Others point to natural wildfires and lightning, ordinary explanations for extraordinary sights. Still others note that Pueblo and Navajo traditions speak of star fire falling to earth, stories that may encode cultural memory of celestial events. Were settlers stumbling upon the footprints of cosmic collisions, or were they misreading natural processes through the lens of myth? The rabbit hole deepens when we recall the later 20th century echoes. After the Trinity nuclear test in 1945, scientists noted how the sand fused into sheets of greenish glass called trinitite. Suddenly, those older tales of glass deserts took on new resonance. Had nature, in its own violent experiments, created prehistoric versions of what mankind had just unleashed? Scholars still debate whether those frontier accounts were genuine encounters with meteor glass, or whether modern eyes retrofitted the story after the atomic age. Even today, hikers report finding strange, glossy shards in arid basins, sometimes mistaken for obsidian, but lacking volcanic context. Each piece feels like a fragment of an untold story, smooth and sharp, both artifact and enigma. And when the desert wind blows across them, scattering light in strange patterns, it is easy to believe the old cowboy yarns, that the land itself once caught fire, and that the memory of that inferno still lingers in the ground. The glass deserts remind us of how the Wild West was not just a human frontier, but a geological and cosmic one too. Beneath the dust lies evidence of forces far older than cattle drives or railroads, forces that shaped the land long before maps or myths, and which remain half buried in the glitter of sand turned to stone. Whispers of red rock, echoes said to answer in human tones. High in the sandstone canyons of the American Southwest, the wind carries peculiar voices. To travellers, these were not the ordinary echoes of stone walls repeating sound. They were sharper, more precise, as if the cliffs themselves listened and replied. In Utah's Red Rock Country, where buttes glow like embers at sunset, cowboys and drifters alike swore that if one shouted a question into certain hollows, the answer came back not as mimicry, but as something altered, almost conversational. These were the whispers of Red Rock, a phenomenon both geological and legendary. Mainstream accounts note that places like Zion Canyon, Monument Valley, and Canyon de Chelly possess extraordinary acoustic properties. Sound bounces and refracts through layers of sandstone, creating echoes that can seem to speak. Early surveyors marveled at how a single rifle shot could roll across the cliffs for nearly a full minute. Native traditions had long described such places as sacred amphitheatres, where voices of ancestors resided in stone. To the Diné or Navajo, the rocks could remember words, storing them like breath inside the canyon's heart. The quirkier stories came from cowboys around campfires. One tale tells of a rider who cursed into the wind, only to hear his insult hurled back twice as loud, startling his horse. Another insisted that late at night the rocks didn't echo words at all, but instead whispered names of the dead, sometimes names the rider recognized. In the 1880s, a prospector claimed he heard a woman's laughter from a cliff face, though no one was near for miles. The strangest tale of all spoke of a canyon where gunshots echoed not as bangs, but as church bells tolling faintly in the distance. Scholars still debate the line between natural acoustics and human imagination. Was the cowboy's laughter merely distorted echo, or was it a mind primed for superstition on lonely nights? Was the bell-like gunshot an auditory illusion, or evidence of unusual geological formations shaping sound into uncanny forms? Geologists argue that variations in canyon width, temperature gradients, and even shifting winds create echoes that seem alive. Folklorists counter that no mere science can account for the persistence of personal names whispered back to riders. The rabbit hole grows deeper when we consider how these echoes intertwined with survival. For indigenous scouts, echoes were more than curiosities. They were warnings, signals, even guides. Stories tell of warriors using specific canyon walls to relay calls in ways enemies couldn't distinguish from natural sounds. Scholars debate whether settlers stumbled upon echoes with awe, or whether they were unknowingly stepping into landscapes already long used as living instruments by those who knew their secrets. Even today, tourists standing in canyons often test the air with claps and shouts, startled by the intimacy of the reply. When one hears a voice roll back, softer but strangely human, it is difficult not to wonder, are we merely speaking to ourselves? Or does the land itself carry memory? The whispers of red rock blur that line, for in those canyons, history, geology, and imagination echo together, answering in tones that feel like more than chants. The iron tusk beast, fossilized mammoths mistaken for living monsters. On the wind-swept plains of Nebraska and the Dakotas, settlers often stumbled upon bones far too large to match any animal they knew. Tusks longer than a man, femurs thicker than a fence post, skulls with cavernous sockets. They seemed to belong to creatures from nightmares. To the frontier imagination, these fossils were not remnants of the Ice Age, but evidence of monsters that might still roam just beyond sight. They called them iron tusk beasts, giants that once shook the prairie with every step. Mainstream history confirms that many of these discoveries were mammoth or mastodon remains, relics of an era when enormous animals roamed North America. In the mid-1800s, farmers ploughing deep sod unearthed teeth the size of bricks, mistaking them for petrified human relics or even proof of biblical giants. The famous Big Bone Lick in Kentucky, though farther east, was already known by then as a site where enormous fossils clustered, fueling both science and myth. By the time paleontology began gaining traction, the frontier had already layered these bones with its own stories. Quirky tales spread quickly through saloons and campfires. Some cowboys claimed they had seen living versions of the beasts, wandering at dusk in remote valleys, their tusks gleaming like iron in fading light. Others swore that storms unearthed the bones because the beasts themselves were restless, thrashing underground. One ranch hand supposedly carved a mammoth tooth into a pipe and declared it gave him dreams of the past, where herds of giants walked the earth. Even today, antique shops across the plains sometimes display old mystery tusks, passed down as family heirlooms, origins half forgotten. Yet scholars still debate how these fossils were truly understood in the Wild West. Were settlers genuinely convinced of living monsters, or did they simply dramatize discoveries to make sense of them? Some historians suggest the iron tusk beast tales reflect a collision of indigenous traditions and settler imagination. native peoples, including the Lakota and Cheyenne, spoke of great animals that once roamed the land, creatures tied to cycles of creation and destruction. Settlers, hearing these stories, may have reshaped them into literal beasts hiding in canyons. The blurred lines between fossil fact and oral legend created fertile ground for rabbit holes. The fascination with gigantic bones also mirrored deeper anxieties. The frontier was vast, filled with dangers beyond human control. To imagine mammoths still lurking in hidden valleys was both terrifying and strangely comforting. It suggested that not everything had been conquered by railroads and rifles. The land, in its enormity, still held secrets. Even today, farmers and construction crews occasionally unearth mammoth tusks across the Midwest and Great Plains. News reports frame them as paleontological treasures, yet the old whispers cling. Scholars still debate whether the persistence of these stories shows ignorance of science or an enduring human need to populate the unknown with living giants. For when the soil offers up tusks gleaming like iron, it is hard not to wonder, did the West bury these beasts forever, or do some still wait, hidden, for nightfall to return? Buried bells of the mission, lost church relics beneath shifting sands. In the arid reaches of the southwest, Spanish missions rose in the 17th and 18th centuries as markers of faith, empire, and survival. Their adobe walls, sun-bleached and crumbling, are visible even today. But frontier lore insists that more lies hidden beneath the ground, bells, crosses, and sacred objects buried in haste when danger loomed. Among these, the tales of lost mission bells ring the loudest, their echoes carried not by sound, but by rumour. Mainstream accounts document that many missions were indeed abandoned suddenly. Attacks, droughts, or simple decline forced priests and converts alike to flee. In some cases, bells were removed and hidden to keep them from being stolen or melted for metal. The San Xavier del Bac mission near Tucson, Arizona, was one such site where bells disappeared, leaving gaps in both the structure and the record. The practice was practical. Bells were valuable, heavy bronze instruments, worth saving even if the mission itself fell silent. Quirky tales, however, embroidered this reality into legend. Travellers claimed to hear bells ringing from beneath the desert sand, especially at twilight. One prospector swore he found the top of a bell protruding from the ground, only to see it sink away when he dug. Ranchers told of horses refusing to cross certain patches of land, as though disturbed by invisible tolls. The most enduring rumour insists that a line of buried bells lies somewhere along the Rio Grande, a hidden chain marking forgotten chapels swallowed by flood or dune. Scholars still debate how much truth these stories hold. Were bells truly buried in secret, or were they simply stolen, melted down, and their absence explained with more romantic tales? Some argue the legends grew out of cultural memory of conflict, when sacred objects were hidden from raiding parties or advancing armies. Others suggest that settlers mistook natural rock formations, or even odd sounds from shifting dunes, as evidence of bells. The idea of buried treasure, especially if sacred, was simply too powerful to ignore. The rabbit hole deepens when indigenous traditions are woven in. Pueblo and Apache communities often remembered missions not as sanctuaries, but as sites of upheaval. In their oral histories, bells sometimes symbolized domination, tools of conversion that disrupted older ways. When stories later circulated of bells sinking into the earth, it may have been less about literal artifacts and more about cultural memory, a sign that the land itself rejected foreign symbols. Scholars still debate whether these interpretations hold, or whether they are modern readings placed upon older, simpler ghost stories. Even today, treasure hunters scour arroyos and desert basins, armed with metal detectors and hope. They dig for bells they may never find, yet the search itself feels part of the myth. Sometimes, fragments of bronze are unearthed, hinges, candle holders, or small devotional objects, but no great cache of bells has ever been uncovered. and yet the belief persists that somewhere, beneath drifting sands, the voices of missions still wait. The buried bells remind us that the West was not only built on ambition and gold, but also on faith and loss. The silence of their absence rings almost as loudly as their toll once did, haunting the frontier with echoes of devotion that history itself could not quite erase. The Watchers on the Mesa, figures reported in twilight, never explained. As the sun sinks over the mesas of New Mexico and Arizona, the horizon sometimes seems to hold more than stone. Cowboys, travelers, and even modern hikers have reported the unsettling sight of silhouettes standing at the rim of a mesa, motionless, silent, watching. When approached, these figures vanish, leaving no trace but the uneasy certainty of being observed. They came to be known in frontier lore as the Watchers on the Mesa, guardians or spectres, depending on the teller. Mainstream history offers natural explanations. The mesas, with their sharp edges and stark lighting, are perfect for optical illusions. Shadows of boulders can stretch into human-like forms at twilight, and distant travellers or herders might appear and disappear against the skyline. Reports of sentinel figures often cluster around places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, sites of ancient Puebloan civilization where cliff dwellings cling to stone. Archaeologists suggest the Watchers are projections of memory, settlers encountering traces of older peoples and interpreting them through myth. But the quirky details transform these sightings into rabbit holes. One cowboy swore he saw 3 figures at dusk, each holding staffs that glowed faintly as the light faded. A railroad surveyor described a single towering silhouette on a mesa edge, which remained visible for nearly an hour before dissolving into nothing. Local children in the 1880s told stories of stone men who came down from the mesas at night to walk the villages. Even modern hikers have reported similar experiences, feeling watched, seeing figures on ridges that vanish upon approach, leaving only wind and silence. Scholars still debate whether these tales are echoes of indigenous stories. Among Hopi and Navajo traditions, mesatops are sacred places of ceremony and guardianship. Kachinas, the spirit beings of the Hopi, are sometimes described as watchers who descend from the mesas during rituals. Were settlers unknowingly witnessing ceremonies from afar, or were they inventing spirits to explain their own unease in alien landscapes? Some historians argue that frontier accounts deliberately sensationalize these visions, folding genuine indigenous practices into ghost stories to entertain Eastern audiences. The Watchers also carry symbolic weight. The mesa itself, towering above the plain, is a place of surveillance. To live in its shadow was to feel observed by something larger, older, beyond human control. In that sense, the figures, real or imagined, embodied the land's authority. Cowboys and miners, used to claiming dominion, suddenly found themselves under the gaze of an older presence. Scholars still debate whether such legends reflect fear of the unknown, guilt over intrusion, or simply the tricks of light in a stark desert. Even now, if one drives the lonely highways of the southwest at twilight, mesas rise in crimson against the darkening sky. From a distance, it is not difficult to imagine figures standing at the rim, silent, patient, perhaps watching us as much as we watch them. Whether guardians, illusions, or memories, the Watchers remind us that in the Wild West, the land itself was never truly empty. It had eyes, and in its gaze, settlers found both wonder and unease. The stone circle plains, forgotten earthworks older than cowboys. Far from the rugged mountains and desert mesas, the Great Plains seem at first to be a land without secrets, flat, endless, monotonous. Yet scattered across Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, early settlers stumbled upon curious arrangements of stones, rings, mounds, and circles laid out with intent. To cowboys driving cattle across the grasslands, these were puzzling relics, older than any fort or homestead, silent but deliberate. They became known simply as the stone circles, and their origins quickly slipped into rabbit hole lore. Mainstream archaeology now tells us that many of these formations were teepee rings, the anchor stones left behind when nomadic peoples lifted their lodges and moved on. Thousands dot the northern plains, testimony to centuries of life before barbed wire and railroads. In places like Wyoming's Bighorn Basin, rings still remain intact, marking campsites used seasonally for generations. These circles, practical and domestic in origin, reveal the mobility and resilience of plains cultures. But quirky stories blurred their meaning for settlers. Some believed the circles were ancient altars, used for sacrifices to gods of the prairie. Others claimed they marked burial grounds, with spirits rising on moonlit nights to dance inside the rings. One prospector near the Black Hills swore he found a circle that glowed faintly under starlight, its stones humming when struck. In saloon talk, the stone circles became portals, gateways to other times, left behind by people whose knowledge settlers could scarcely imagine. Scholars still debate how these stone formations were interpreted across cultures. For indigenous peoples, the rings were everyday remnants of life, but they also carried symbolic weight. Among the Blackfoot and Crow, circles reflected the cycles of life, migration, and renewal. For settlers unfamiliar with this context, the formations became blank slates for projection, mysteries that filled the silence of the plains. Were the stone circles misunderstood evidence of routine living, or did some hold ceremonial functions that archaeology has yet to uncover? The rabbit hole widens with discoveries like the medicine wheel in Wyoming, a massive stone circle aligned with solstices and star paths. Unlike tipi rings, this structure appears ceremonial, linking the plains to sky knowledge stretching back centuries. The coexistence of domestic rings and astronomical wheels complicates the picture. Not all circles served the same purpose. Scholars still debate whether smaller rings sometimes had dual meanings, both household anchors and ritual spaces. Even today, farmers ploughing fields uncover stone circles, some dismantled, others preserved out of curiosity. Tourists visiting preserved sites feel the weight of age in these simple patterns of rock. The plains, so often described as empty, reveal themselves as carefully marked and remembered. Each ring whispers of meals shared, stories told, songs sung, and migrations undertaken. The stone circles remind us that the West was never truly wild or empty. It was patterned, inhabited, and deeply known. For settlers, they were mysteries. For archaeologists, evidence. For native peoples, memory. And as we stand on those plains today, gazing at rings of stone half sunk in grass, we find ourselves caught in that overlap, uncertain whether we're looking at ordinary anchors or extraordinary symbols. The answer, like the circles themselves, is both simple and profound. The silver river that vanished, a waterway erased overnight. On maps of the frontier, rivers were lifelines. They meant water for crops, routes for trade, and a measure of stability in an otherwise unpredictable land. Yet some settlers told of a river that seemed to defy the rules, appearing in journals and stories, only to vanish entirely. They called it the Silver River, a stream said to shimmer like quicksilver under the moon. Reports placed it in the arid stretches of New Mexico or Texas, but no surveyor ever marked it with certainty. Its disappearance became one of the West's strangest whispered rabbit holes. Mainstream history acknowledges that rivers do vanish. In karst regions of Texas and New Mexico, streams sink underground into limestone caverns, leaving dry beds behind. Seasonal flooding could also trick travelers. a rushing waterway one year might become a dusty gully the next. The Silver River may have been one of these natural illusions, a misread landscape in an era of imperfect mapping. Still, its absence in later records puzzled those who had sworn they drank from it. Quirky accounts gave the river a more supernatural edge. Cowboys claimed it would appear only at night, reflecting starlight even when skies were overcast. One prospector insisted he filled a canteen from its waters, only to find the liquid had turned to dust by morning. Families on wagon trains said they camped beside its banks, hearing it sing like wind through silver reeds. Yet when they tried to retrace their steps, the river was gone, leaving no trace but parched earth. Scholars still debate whether the Silver River was a misremembered tributary of the Rio Grande, or Pecos, or whether it belonged more to myth than geography. Some argue that exhaustion and mirages led settlers to believe in water where none existed. Others suggest that local indigenous traditions, speaking of spirit rivers that appear in dreams, were misunderstood and retold as literal sightings. The debate deepens with journals that mention the river directly, penned by men otherwise considered reliable observers. Was the Silver River a mistake, a mirage, or a phenomenon yet unexplained? The rabbit hole widens when one considers the symbolism. Water in the desert is life itself. A river that appears and vanishes plays into both hope and despair, the eternal uncertainty of the frontier. Some scholars argue that the story endures not because of geography, but because it encapsulates the psychological landscape of settlers, always chasing a promise that might dissolve at dawn. Even today, hikers in remote canyons sometimes report finding damp earth where no creek should flow, or hearing the faint sound of water in dry arroyos. Science can explain much of it: underground springs, shifting aquifers, or echoes on wind. And yet the tale of the Silver River still glimmers in oral tradition, shimmering like quicksilver on the horizon of memory. In the end, the vanishing river reminds us that the Wild West was never fully charted, never completely tamed. For every line drawn on a map, another dissolved into mystery. The Silver River flows still, if not in the land, then in the imagination of those who walked the frontier, and in the quiet spaces where the desert keeps its secrets. The Thunderbird's Canyon, giant birds said to shadow riders. Across the sweeping sky of the American West, storms could rise without warning. Thunder cracked, lightning split the horizon, and wind turned the plains into chaos. For generations, indigenous traditions spoke of immense birds riding those storms, thunderbirds, beings of power whose wings beat with thunder and whose eyes flashed lightning. In frontier times, settlers entering the canyons of the Dakotas and Arizona swore they, too, had seen vast shadows crossing the cliffs. Thus emerged the legend of the Thunderbird's Canyon, where giants of the sky seemed to linger long after myth should have ended. Mainstream accounts recognize that such traditions were deeply rooted in native cosmologies. Among the Lakota, the Thunderbird was a guardian spirit, associated with storms and renewal. The Algonquian peoples described it as a protector against great serpents of the deep. For the Diné and Hopi farther southwest, great birds appeared in stories as messengers between worlds. When settlers encountered these tales, they filtered them through their own imaginations, often blending them with sightings of large eagles, condors, or even storms casting bird-like shadows across canyon walls. The quirks of frontier lore added stranger details. In 1890, a newspaper in Tombstone, Arizona, ran a sensational story about two cowboys who allegedly shot a giant bird with leathery wings spanning over 90 feet. Some claimed its body was displayed briefly in town before vanishing into rumor. In later decades, supposed photographs of captured thunderbirds circulated, though none have ever been authenticated. Miners in canyons told of hearing great wing beats echoing through storm clouds louder than any natural bird could produce. Children whispered of skeletons embedded in canyon walls, bones so large they must have belonged to creatures lost to time. Scholars still debate whether the Thunderbird sightings were misidentifications of actual wildlife, such as the California condor, whose wingspan can reach nearly 10 feet, or echoes of Ice Age fossils uncovered in cliffs. Some folklorists argue that reports of gigantic birds in the 19th century reflect a deeper cultural need. In a land being rapidly tamed, legends of immense, uncontrollable beings preserved a sense of awe. Others suggest hoaxes played a role, with tall tales spun to sell newspapers and entertain restless settlers. The rabbit hole deepens with archaeology. Fossilized remains of enormous prehistoric birds, like teratons with wingspans up to 20 feet, have been discovered in the Americas. Could rare exposures of such bones in canyon walls have fueled the legends? Or were the stories simply metaphorical, preserving cultural memory of creatures long extinct? Scholars still debate whether the Thunderbird should be read as symbol, science, or some mysterious blend of both. Even today, hikers in canyon lands report seeing strange shadows flit across the rock faces, far too large, they insist, to be hawks or ravens. Some photographs capture odd silhouettes in the stormy sky, which skeptics attribute to perspective or trick of light. And yet, standing in a canyon as thunder rolls and shadows dance, it is easy to feel the pull of the old stories. The Thunderbird's Canyon is less about proving the existence of giants, and more about preserving the sense of scale and mystery that the frontier inspired. In a West so vast that even the horizon seemed alive, perhaps the people needed creatures large enough to match it. Whether myth, mistake, or memory, the thunder still carries their wings. Salt plains of bones, white flats littered with strange skeletons. The high plains of Oklahoma and Kansas can feel otherworldly at times, wide expanses of white salt stretching beneath an endless sky. These flats, once ancient seabeds, shimmer under the sun like frozen lakes. To settlers, they were uncanny places, desolate, blinding, and strangely silent. Yet the strangest stories came from what lay scattered across their surface: bones. Travellers swore the salt plains were littered with skeletons, some from buffalo herds, others from creatures unrecognisable, half buried in glistening crust. These salt plains of bones became an unsettling frontier mystery. Mainstream accounts note that mass animal deaths were not unusual. Before settlement, immense herds of bison crossed the plains, sometimes lured to salt licks in deadly numbers. Droughts or storms could kill thousands at once, leaving their bones to bleach under the sun. In Oklahoma's Great Salt Plains, archaeologists have documented deposits of fossil remains mixed with mineral crystals, natural evidence of an environment shaped by water, salt, and extinction. What settlers saw as inexplicable may have been remnants of both Ice Age megafauna and historic die-offs. Quirky tales, however, expanded these findings into legend. Some pioneers claimed they saw skeletons larger than elephants, rib cages arching high enough for a man to ride a horse through. Others told of skulls with horns like twisted trees, bleached white and half buried in the salt. A trapper once insisted he found a row of human skeletons arranged in a circle, preserved by the salt as if frozen in ceremony. Stories spread of buffalo hunters who avoided the flats, muttering that the bones were cursed, remnants of a battle between spirits. Scholars still debate how to interpret such accounts. Were they exaggerations of genuine fossil finds, mastodon, mistaken for monsters, or twisted bison skulls mistaken for hybrids? Or were they deliberate tales designed to keep rival hunters or settlers away from valuable salt deposits? Some argue the circular arrangements were natural erosion patterns, while others suspect they were traces of ancient campsites, misunderstood by outsiders. The tension between geology, archaeology, and folklore leaves the question unresolved. The rabbit hole deepens with indigenous traditions. For some native nations, salt plains were sacred places associated with creation stories and ceremonial gathering. Bones scattered across their surface were not random remains, but markers of cycles, life given to the land, preserved in white crust as part of balance. When settlers stumbled across the same bones, they read them instead as signs of catastrophe or mystery. Scholars still debate whether the settlers' horror reflected misunderstanding, or whether they sensed, in their own way, the land's deeper story. Even now, visitors to the Great Salt Plains sometimes find odd fragments protruding from the ground, pieces of antler, bison vertebrae, even teeth fossilized in gypsum. The salt preserves them eerily well, making it easy to imagine ancient giants or forgotten battles. Under the glare of the sun, the white ground seems almost endless, and the bones, stark against it, feel like messages. Were they warnings, relics, or simply the residue of time? The salt plains remind us that the West was once an ocean, then a grassland, and always a graveyard. In those glittering fields of white, bones whisper of extinctions, migrations, and mysteries older than history. And as we stand on their surface, crunching salt underfoot, it is hard to resist the sense that we are walking across the skin of time itself, thin and fragile, stretched over secrets that still rise to the light. The vanishing telegraph crew, workers gone, poles left standing. The telegraph promised to shrink the vastness of the American West into wires and pulses of electricity. By the 1860s, lines stretched across prairies, deserts, and mountain passes, each pole a step toward binding the frontier to the rest of the nation. But among the many tales of hardship in building those lines, one stands apart: stories of a telegraph crew that vanished, leaving their poles and tools behind, as if work had simply stopped mid-stride. Mainstream records show how difficult telegraph construction was. Crews faced heat, blizzards, hostile terrain, and sometimes violence from raids or disputes with locals. Journals describe abandoned sections where funding collapsed or workers fled epidemics. In one 1870s case along the Platte River, work halted abruptly after a cholera outbreak, leaving poles half sunk in mud. Over time, the skeletons of such projects littered the West, silent reminders of interrupted ambition. But the quirky details of the vanishing crew make the story stranger. Travellers reported finding stretches of telegraph poles erected neatly for miles, with tools and supply wagons nearby, but no men. One prospector claimed to discover campfires still warm, meals left half-eaten, and yet no footprints leading away. Another tale told of a crew working near a canyon who seemed to disappear overnight, their wagons standing as if waiting for hands that never returned. Local ranchers insisted the line simply swallowed them. Scholars still debate the reliability of such accounts. Were these stories exaggerated by lonely travellers eager to enliven dull routes? Or did real disappearances occur, explained by ambush, disease, or sudden flight? Some historians suggest that newspapers magnified routine desertions, crews walking off the job for unpaid wages, into sensational vanishings. Others argue that small-scale violence, erased from official reports, may lie at the heart of the tales. Were crews massacred, their deaths concealed by companies unwilling to admit failure? The rabbit hole grows deeper when folklore blends in. Among some native accounts, telegraph poles were described as talking trees, unsettling intrusions into the land. Stories of crews who disappeared were interpreted as consequences for disturbing balance, punishment for stretching wires across sacred spaces. Whether these interpretations came directly from indigenous voices or from settlers retelling them with fear is still debated by scholars. What is certain is that the image of men vanishing, leaving their labour standing mute in the landscape, haunted the imagination. Even today, in remote corners of the plains, one can find leaning telegraph poles, their wires long gone, their purpose forgotten. They march into the distance like gravestones for workers whose names were never recorded. Travellers who come across such remnants sometimes recall the old stories, wondering whether the men who placed them finished their task, or whether they too became part of the West's unsolved disappearances. The vanishing telegraph crew reminds us that progress was not always triumphant. Sometimes it faltered, leaving behind skeletal remains of ambition and silence where voices should have been. Whether by disease, violence, or imagination, the crew that vanished became part of a larger truth. The frontier was a place where even those tasked with connecting it could themselves be cut off forever. The burning river, flames on water, baffled settlers for weeks. On the frontier, rivers were both friend and foe, life-giving water in arid lands, yet unpredictable in flood or drought. But in some corners of the Wild West, settlers told of rivers that burned. Imagine the shock of arriving at a stream to see tongues of flame dancing across its surface, fire and water locked in the same restless current. These tales of burning rivers spread across campfires, newspapers and journals, leaving confusion in their wake. Mainstream accounts point to natural explanations. Certain rivers in coal-rich regions of Colorado and Wyoming passed through areas where seams of bitumen or coal outcropped along the banks. Natural oil seepage could coat the surface, igniting when touched by lightning or even sparks from campfires. In other cases, methane gas bubbled from riverbeds, capable of sudden ignition under the right conditions. By the late 19th century, geologists noted such phenomena in the Powder River Basin, though their findings rarely travelled as quickly or as sensationally as rumour. The quirky details, however, gave these burning rivers a stranger cast. A Kansas homesteader claimed he saw flames that lasted through the night, moving upstream against the current as though alive. A trapper told of fish leaping through fire, scales blackened yet swimming on, half charred and half alive. In saloons, storytellers described entire stretches of water glowing like molten metal under moonlight, enough to make men wonder if hell itself had broken through the earth. Children grew up afraid to approach such rivers, muttering that they would catch fire from the inside if they drank. Scholars still debate whether the settlers exaggerated isolated natural events into legends. Was a flicker of methane flame retold as a river ablaze for weeks, or did frontier observers witness more suspiciously aimed phenomena, coal seam fires leaking into waterways creating long-lived blazes? Some historians argue that burning river stories were coloured by biblical language, settlers interpreting unfamiliar sights through the lens of Sodom and Gomorrah, lakes of fire and divine punishment. Others suggest the tales were shaped by indigenous warnings about dangerous waters, retold with apocalyptic flair. The rabbit hole deepens when we consider how memory preserved these stories. In Ohio and Pennsylvania, far from the frontier, rivers polluted by industry would later catch fire in the 20th century, providing eerie confirmation that water really could burn. Did such events lend credibility retroactively to the old Western tales? Scholars still debate whether frontier accounts were dismissed too quickly, only to find echoes of truth in later centuries. Today, hikers in the Badlands sometimes stumble across trickling seeps, where oil still slicks the water, rainbow-coloured and faintly flammable. Coal seam fires continue to burn underground in Wyoming and Montana, some for decades, occasionally venting through cracks to ignite brush or soil. Standing near such places, one can almost imagine the settlers' awe and terror. Fire, the most familiar of elements, had broken its bounds and claimed the rivers too. The burning rivers of the frontier remind us that the West was not only a stage for human drama, but also a landscape alive with geologic strangeness. When water burns, certainty falters. And in that flicker of flame upon the current, settlers glimpsed not just science, but mystery. An uneasy marriage of earth, fire, and time that no map could explain. The clockwork crucifix, frontier relic with gears no one could explain. Among the strangest stories whispered in the West was that of a crucifix, simple in shape, carved from wood or bronze, yet fitted with tiny gears inside. According to accounts from miners and frontier priests, the object was discovered in the 1870s in a remote Arizona mission ruin. It looked like an ordinary cross until shaken, when faint clicks and rattles gave away an inner mechanism. No one could quite explain why such a device existed, or how it had found its way into the desert. Mainstream history admits that odd artifacts sometimes surfaced in frontier ruins. Missions and trading posts often held objects brought from Mexico, Spain, or even farther afield. European clockwork and devotional items occasionally travelled west with priests or merchants. It's entirely possible, historians argue, that the clockwork crucifix was nothing more than a finely made reliquary with mechanical fittings designed to hold relics or incense. Yet the story spread because none of those who examined it could open the mechanism or understand what it was meant to do. The quirkier details turned it into a frontier rabbit hole. Some claimed the cross ticked faintly at midnight, though no spring was ever wound. A miner swore he saw its arms rotate slowly, as if pointing towards something unseen. One local legend insisted the gears were etched with markings resembling constellations, and that when aligned, the cross could be used as a map of the stars. Others whispered that the crucifix was older than the mission itself, carried from a vanished Spanish settlement, or even left by explorers who had wandered into lands unknown. Scholars still debate whether the object ever truly existed. Was the clockwork crucifix a traveller's tall tale told to amuse in saloons? Or was it a genuine artifact, now lost to time, misinte, appreted by untrained eyes? Some argue the story reflects anxiety at the collision of faith and technology, the cross, symbol of belief, interwoven with gears, symbol of modernity. Others suggest it was inspired by contemporary fascination with automata, mechanical devices that seemed magical in an age before widespread machines. The rabbit hole deepens with comparisons to out-of-place artifacts, strange finds reported in newspapers of the 19th century, Roman coins in Ohio, brass bells in coal seams, often later dismissed but never fully explained. Was the clockwork crucifix part of this same cultural phenomenon, where unusual but explainable objects were inflated into mysteries? Or did a real artifact once lie hidden in a ruined chapel, its mechanism still clicking faintly beneath desert dust? Scholars still debate whether we should treat the tale as folklore or lost history. Even today, treasure hunters in Arizona's Sonoran Desert claim to seek the crucifix. Antique dealers sometimes display mechanical crosses with tiny inner gears, marketing them as inspired by the legend. None match the description exactly. What lingers is the image of a relic, both sacred and mechanical, lying in the ruins of faith on the edge of the frontier, bridging devotion and mystery. The clockwork crucifix reminds us that the West was not only a theatre of grit and gunpowder, but also a place where wonder survived. In objects that resisted explanation, in stories that blurred the sacred and the strange, in whispers that perhaps some things were not meant to be fully understood, the singing dunes, sandhills that hummed like choirs. The desert is often imagined as silence, a still expanse where only the wind breaks the hush. But travellers in the American West sometimes reported something stranger, sand that sang. In certain dunes, particularly in Nevada and California, the movement of grains produced low, resonant tones, as though the earth itself were humming. These singing dunes became eerie landmarks for settlers and indigenous peoples alike, their voices rolling across the night like choirs with no bodies to sing them. Mainstream accounts confirm the phenomenon. The Eureka Dunes in California's Death Valley and the Kelso Dunes in the Mojave Desert are famous today for their booming sand. When large amounts of dry sand slide down steep slopes, friction creates vibrations in the air. The result is a sound like an organ's drone or the hum of distant thunder, sometimes carrying for miles. Modern scientists have measured the tones, usually between 70 and 105 hertz, low enough to feel in one's chest. But the quirky stories give the dunes a mystical cast. Miners camping near Kelso claimed the sand moaned whenever storms approached, as though warning them. Cowboys said the dunes sang louder under moonlight, their tones shifting like voices rising in harmony. In one tale, a group of travellers swore the dunes echoed their own hymns back to them, as if joining in chorus. The Paiute people had long considered the phenomenon sacred, describing the dunes as the voices of spirits, either warning or comforting those who passed by. Scholars still debate how much of the folklore reflects genuine experience and how much stems from embellishment. While the physics of booming sand is well documented, the variability of the effect, sometimes loud, sometimes silent, adds mystery. Why do some dunes sing often, while others fall quiet for years? Did settlers truly hear voices, or did their imaginations translate deep vibrations into something more human? Some argue that in the loneliness of the desert, people were primed to interpret sound as presence. Others suggest cultural blending, indigenous spiritual interpretations retold in settler language as ghostly choirs. The rabbit hole deepens when we consider how widespread such dunes are. Singing sands exist not only in California, but in Colorado, Nevada, and even Oregon, suggesting that many frontier travelers may have encountered the phenomenon. Yet because it seemed unearthly, it often went unrecorded in official surveys. Instead, it thrived in oral accounts and local legend, passed on with awe. Scholars still debate whether the dune's inconsistent singing reflects only shifting sand conditions, or whether atmospheric, even cosmic, factors play a role. Even today, visitors to the Eureka or Kelso dunes can sometimes coax the sand to sing by sliding down their slopes. The sound swells like an invisible choir, vibrating through the body. Standing there, surrounded by endless sand, one can understand why earlier travelers felt the desert was alive. The dunes seemed not just to reflect sound, but to generate their own, voices rising from the earth itself. The singing dunes remind us that the frontier was filled not only with silence and desolation, but with music of an ancient kind. In those deep, resonant tones, settlers heard warnings, prayers, or spirits. Scientists hear grains vibrating in unison. Between those explanations lies a space where wonder lingers, echoing still across the desert night. The Bleeding Butte, rock that oozed crimson during storms. In the rugged badlands of the American West, weather could transform the land in unsettling ways. Travelers spoke of a particular butte, a solitary, flat-topped hill that seemed to bleed when rain lashed against it. Streams of red trickled down its flanks, staining the soil as though the stone itself were alive. Locals called it the Bleeding Butte, a landmark both feared and revered, a place where the earth appeared to wound itself in storms. Mainstream geology offers an explanation. Many formations in the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Utah contain iron-rich minerals. When rainwater seeps through these rocks, the iron oxidizes, creating streaks of deep crimson. To a trained eye, it's rust in action, nature painting stone with iron oxide. But to settlers unused to such sights, especially when the sky thundered above, it was nothing less than the land weeping blood. Quirky frontier stories expanded on the phenomenon. Cowboys claimed that the butte bled only during storms that brought tragedy, predicting stampedes, drownings, or ambushes. One prospector swore he saw the red trickles form shapes resembling human hands pressed against the cliff face. Ranchers told of cattle refusing to graze near the hill, spooked by some instinct they could not explain. Some said the streams ran warm, steaming in the rain, as though life-blood itself pulsed through the rock. Scholars still debate how much of this was natural observation and how much was heightened by imagination. Iron oxide explains the red colour, but could it really seem like flowing blood in heavy storms? Was the butte simply an ordinary formation exaggerated into legend by frightened eyes? Or did locals truly witness something stranger, some rare chemical reaction or mineral composition that gave the hill a more vivid, disturbing appearance? Folklorists suggest that such tales reflect a deeper human impulse to treat the land as animate, capable of feeling pain and expressing omen. The rabbit hole grows when we consider indigenous traditions. Some Sioux and Cheyenne stories speak of hills marked by the blood of battles, where earth itself remembers the fallen. Scholars debate whether the settler stories of the Bleeding Butte borrowed unconsciously from such traditions, blending geology with cultural echoes. Was the butte bleeding, or was it reminding those who looked upon it of conflicts buried in its shadow? Even today, hikers in the Badlands occasionally report seeing red streaks appear after rainfall, sharp against pale stone. Photographs capture the eerie sight, rivulets like open wounds trickling down a silent hill. Standing before it with thunder rumbling overhead, it is easy to imagine why earlier travellers whispered of curses and omens. The butte seems less like rock than a sentinel, alive with memory. The Bleeding Butte reminds us that the West was not simply dry dust and neutral stone. It was a landscape that seemed to move, to bleed, to respond. In its crimson streaks, settlers saw signs of divine wrath, or nature's sorrow, or something stranger still. Whether chemistry or omen, the sight unsettled all who saw it, leaving a mark on memory as indelible as the stains on the stone. The hollow graveyard, coffins found empty beneath wooden crosses. On the frontier, cemeteries often stood at the edge of town, rows of rough-hewn wooden crosses marking the final rest of cowboys, settlers and drifters who met their end on the unforgiving plains. But tales spread of a particular graveyard in the west, where, when storms or floods exposed the earth, coffins were found empty. The markers remained, weathered and solemn, yet beneath them there were no bodies. This hollow graveyard became a story told with equal parts fear and fascination. Mainstream history offers practical explanations. Frontier burials were often shallow, hurried affairs. Wooden coffins, if used at all, decayed quickly in damp soil, collapsing inward until nothing remained but impressions in the earth. Floods could wash away remains, scavengers could disturb shallow graves, and shifting land might cause coffins to sink or break apart. By the time later generations inspected the sites, only the shells of graves remained. Yet the quirky stories made the phenomenon much harder to dismiss. Travellers described prying open coffins only to find them lined neatly, lids intact, but containing nothing but air. Some swore that clothing and boots lay undisturbed inside, but the bodies had vanished, leaving garments without flesh. One preacher claimed he saw a coffin with a glass viewing pane, and behind it only darkness, as though the corpse had dissolved. Ranch children grew up whispering that the graveyard was cursed, that the dead had risen and walked away. Scholars still debate whether such accounts reflect real discoveries or frontier embellishment. Were the coffins truly intact and empty, or had time and rot simply erased what lay within? Some historians suspect the legends were shaped by anxiety. Frontier communities often buried the unclaimed or unnamed, creating unease about whether the rested peacefully. others point to cultural blending. Indigenous beliefs in restless spirits may have mingled with settler fears of disturbed graves. Did the stories of hollow coffins arise from real sights, or from the heavy weight of guilt over lives forgotten? The rabbit hole deepens with one persistent rumour, that some bodies were deliberately removed. In times of violence or scandal, towns might secretly exhume and relocate corpses to hide evidence of murder, theft, or disgrace. Scholars still debate whether certain hollow graveyards were less about supernatural vanishings and more about deliberate cover-ups, leaving communities haunted by absence. Even today, in remote cemeteries across the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming, visitors find crosses marking ground where no bones remain. Archaeological surveys sometimes confirm that coffins collapsed or disintegrated, leaving only soil stains. Yet for those who walk through at dusk, the emptiness feels uncanny. The markers stand like sentinels, guarding nothing, memorializing those who are no longer there in flesh or dust. The hollow graveyard reminds us that the West's stories of death were never tidy. Graves could be shallow, bodies lost, records absent. But in the imagination, these gaps turned into ghostly narratives, coffins without corpses, markers for the missing, whispers that perhaps the dead themselves had chosen to leave. And in that unsettling silence, the graveyard became less a place of rest and more a place of questions. The lantern that walked, a moving light across open prairie. On the vast prairies of Kansas and Nebraska, night could feel infinite. Stars blazed, coyotes howled, and the land stretched so far that the line between earth and sky blurred. Yet travellers often spoke of something stranger than silence or shadow. A light that moved across the open ground, steady as a lantern carried in a human hand. But no figure ever accompanied it. Cowboys called it simply the lantern that walked, an eerie presence gliding across grasslands long after campfires burned out. Mainstream explanations fall back on natural science. Ball lightning, caused by unstable electrical discharges during storms, can appear as glowing spheres drifting across the horizon. Swamp gas, igniting in low wetlands, sometimes produces flickering lights known in folklore as will-o'-the-wisps. In the frontier West, these phenomena could account for strange illuminations seen at night. Surveyors in the late 19th century even recorded such events near marshy ground, noting how they seemed to mimic lanterns. But the quirky details of the lantern stories went further. Cowboys claimed the light kept pace with riders, bobbing just ahead as though leading them. Wagon trains told of it appearing on nights when travellers were lost, the glow seeming to beckon, sometimes towards safety, other times deeper into the prairie until it vanished, leaving them disoriented. One tale spoke of a ranch hand who followed the light for miles, only to find himself at the edge of a deep ravine, saved at the last moment by his startled horse. Another claimed the lantern passed directly through a corral fence without slowing, disappearing into the fields beyond. Scholars still debate whether the stories reflect mere natural lights or something more psychological. Was the lantern a projection of loneliness, a mind conjuring company on the endless plain, or were settlers reframing indigenous stories of spirit lights, retelling them through the imagery of lanterns they knew well? Folklorists point out how common light apparition stories are worldwide, often cast as omens, guides, or tricksters. The prairie versions may be part of a larger pattern of humanity's fascination with unexplained illumination. The rabbit hole grows deeper with persistence. Reports of ghostly lanterns did not end in the 19th century. In places like Oklahoma and Texas, the so-called spook lights still draw visitors, with glowing orbs drifting across open country roads. Scientists test explanations ranging from headlights refracting in temperature inversions to methane flares, yet the lights continue to behave unpredictably. Scholars still debate whether these phenomena are fully understood, or whether some remain unexplained. Even now, travellers on lonely highways sometimes glimpse a pale glow bobbing across fields, too steady to be lightning, too isolated to be human. Some stop to watch, convinced they've seen the lantern of an old cowboy still walking the prairie. Others drive on quickly, preferring not to test whether the light leads anywhere at all. The lantern that walked reminds us how easily the familiar becomes uncanny. A simple glow in the night can carry hope, fear, or warning. For the settlers of the Wild West, it was both guide and ghost, something they could never quite catch, forever just ahead, walking the prairie without rest. The vanished herd trail, cattle tracks ending in nothingness. The cattle drive was the lifeblood of the frontier economy. From Texas to Kansas, herds by the thousands thundered north, carving ruts into prairie soil and leaving dust that hung in the sky for days. Trails like the Chisholm and the Goodnight Loving became arteries of the Wild West, their paths still visible in places today. Yet cowboys told of something unsettling, trails where hoofprints and wagon ruts simply ended. Whole herds, they swore, seemed to vanish, their tracks dissolving into empty ground as though swallowed by the earth. Mainstream history acknowledges that herds were sometimes lost. Stampedes could scatter cattle into canyons, drought could drive them to die at dry riverbeds, and rustlers could divert them away under cover of night. Tracks ending abruptly might reflect soil conditions, hardpan or rocky ground where hooves left no mark. Rainstorms, too, could erase trails in hours, leaving the impression that cattle had walked into nothingness. But these explanations did little to quiet the stranger tales passed along by campfires. The quirky stories are what linger. Cowboys told of following clear tracks across soft prairie grass, only to see them stop in a wide circle, as if the herd had gathered and then evaporated. Others spoke of wagon ruts leading straight into flat ground, with no sign of turning or dispersal. A legendary account from West Texas described thousands of tracks leading toward a canyon rim, but none descending, as though the herd had stepped into the sky. Some insisted the ground itself had closed up behind the cattle, leaving no sign of their passing. Scholars still debate how much of this is myth and how much is misperception. Were cowboys, exhausted from long rides, exaggerating strange erasures of tracks by weather, or do these stories reflect deeper anxieties about the fragility of livelihood in a land where a single misstep could destroy fortunes? Folklorists argue that tales of vanished herds acted as cautionary parables, reminders of how quickly success could turn to ruin. Others suggest they may be echoes of indigenous accounts of herds moving mysteriously, later reframed through settler eyes. The rabbit hole deepens with one enduring rumour that some vanished herds were not lost but deliberately erased. Whispers of outlaw crews or even unscrupulous ranchers scattering cattle and disguising trails hint at human trickery. Scholars still debate whether stories of trails ending in nothingness conceal darker tales of theft and violence. Even today, on lonely stretches of prairie, faint cattle ruts from the 19th century still cross the grass. In places, they do seem to fade without warning, ending in open fields with no clear continuation. Archaeologists explain this as natural erosion, yet the effect can be uncanny, like a road that promises a destination but refuses to deliver. For modern visitors, the silence of those abrupt endings feels like confirmation of the old cowboy tales. The vanished herd trail reminds us that the West was not only about the herds that thundered visibly north, but also about the mysteries that disappeared along the way. Whether erased by weather, stolen by men, or swallowed by imagination, those empty trails remain scars in the land, evidence of journeys that seemed to stop before their stories could. The copper faces, masks buried in desert caves. In the arid southwest, where canyons cut deep into sandstone and caves lie hidden in shadow, stories grew of strange relics buried far from any known settlement. Prospectors and ranchers whispered of copper faces, masks hammered from thin sheets of metal, human visages staring blankly from beneath the dust. These finds, if true, unsettled those who discovered them, for they seemed out of place, belonging neither to the Pueblo ruins nearby nor to any familiar frontier tradition. Mainstream archaeology provides some grounding. Native peoples across the Americas did craft masks, often from wood, stone or clay, and in rare cases from hammered copper. Trade networks extended astonishingly far. Copper mined in the Great Lakes region travelled across the continent, reaching the plains and southwest centuries before Europeans arrived. It is plausible, then, that small copper artifacts might have been deposited in caves, carried by trade or ritual. Yet the stories of full masks, shaped with eerily human detail, stretch beyond known examples. The quirky details add unease. A miner in the 1880s reportedly uncovered a mask with hollow eyes so polished they reflected torchlight. A ranch hand claimed to find a copper face fused into a cave wall, as if swallowed by the stone itself. Some masks, it was said, bore expressions of anguish, mouths open in silent screams. One prospector swore that after carrying a mask out of a canyon, his camp was plagued by strange sounds at night, footsteps, whispers, and coppery gleams in the dark, until he returned it. Scholars still debate whether these tales are evidence of real artifacts or frontier invention. Were settlers misinterpreting natural mineral sheets or eroded rocks as human forms? Or did genuine copper relics exist, later exaggerated into full masks? Some argue that treasure hunting culture encouraged tall tales to inflate the lure of remote caves. Others suggest that genuine indigenous artifacts, sacred in origin, were misused or sensationalized by those who stumbled upon them. The rabbit hole grows deeper with echoes of cultural memory. Among Pueblo traditions, mask dances invoked spirits, with the mask serving as a vessel of transformation. In that light, stories of abandoned or buried masks may reflect rituals of closure, objects deliberately hidden when no longer in use. Yet settlers, unaware of this context, may have read them instead as ghostly relics, objects with powers too strange to possess. Scholars still debate whether the copper faces were fact, fiction, or a blurred mixture of both. Even today, the rumor persists. Hikers in Arizona and New Mexico sometimes claim to find fragments of hammered copper in caves, green with age, their shapes suggestive of faces. No definitive artifact has ever been placed in a museum, but the tales remain alive in local lore. The desert, with its deep silences and endless hiding places, protects its secrets well. The copper faces remind us that the West was not only a land of visible monuments, but of hidden ones, buried in caves and canyons where light barely reaches. Whether they were genuine masks carried by ancient traders, or illusions shaped by imagination and greed, they left behind a story more enduring than the metal itself, the image of blank copper eyes, watching, long after their makers were gone. The endless well, a shaft that swallowed all who entered. In the dry reaches of Texas and New Mexico, water meant survival. Wells were dug at great effort, shafts cut into rock and soil in search of groundwater. Yet settlers told of one strange sight they avoided, a well that seemed to have no bottom. The rope would drop and drop, never striking water, never hitting stone. Men called it the endless well, a mouth in the earth that swallowed light, sound, and sometimes lives. Mainstream geology can account for such features. Karst landscapes, common in parts of the southwest, contain sinkholes and vertical caves that plunge hundreds of feet into underground chambers. Explorers of the 19th century occasionally mistook these natural pits for failed wells. In some cases, ropes broke, echoes carried oddly, and depth appeared limitless. To settlers unaccustomed to such formations, the impression of a bottomless well was both plausible and terrifying. But the quirky tales make the legend darker. One cowboy claimed he dropped a lantern into the well and watched it burn all the way down, never hitting bottom before it winked out. A prospector insisted he heard rushing water far below, yet no bucket ever returned wet. In one chilling account, a rancher lowered a goat into the shaft as a test, only for the rope to return frayed, the animal gone. Some versions tell of human explorers lowered by their companions who never called back. Scholars still debate the meaning behind these stories. Were they exaggerated accounts of sinkholes too deep for crude ropes? Were they cover stories for disappearances, men lost to accidents, crimes, or desertion? Folklorists point out that bottomless pits appear in myths worldwide, often symbolizing portals to other realms. Did settlers, encountering natural chasms, instinctively frame them in terms of cosmic abysses? Or were they repeating indie, genus stories of sacred holes in the earth, reinterpreted as wells? The rabbit hole deepens with rumours of sounds. Some locals claimed that the endless well breathed, exhaling cool air at night, inhaling during the day. Others said that dropping stones into it produced not a clatter, but a muffled hum, as if the earth swallowed sound itself. A handful of stories even linked the well to disappearances, missing cattle, stray travellers, or stolen goods, all said to have been dragged below. Scholars still debate whether these were inventions to explain loss or genuine mysteries. Even today, sinkholes across the West inspire similar awe. In Carlsbad Caverns, New Mexico, natural pits extend into vast subterranean halls, so deep early explorers feared their ropes would never reach bottom. The Devil's Sinkhole in Texas plunges nearly 400 feet, once believed to be endless. Standing at such rims, one feels the vertigo settlers described, the uncanny sense of staring into an abyss that does not return your gaze. The endless well reminds us that the frontier was not only about reaching outward but also downward, into depths both literal and imagined. For settlers desperate for water, a shaft that yielded nothing was already despair. To find one that seemed infinite turned despair into dread. In its darkness they saw more than geology. They saw the possibility that the West contained holes not just in the earth, but in understanding itself, the star carvings, ancient constellations etched in canyon walls. Deep within the sandstone canyons of the American Southwest, settlers stumbled upon carvings that seemed to map the night sky. Stars, clusters, and spirals dotted cliff faces, arranged not at random, but in patterns recognizable to anyone who had camped beneath desert constellations. These star carvings puzzled the frontier eye. Who had etched them? How old were they? And why did they mirror the heavens so precisely? Mainstream archaeology points to well-documented traditions. The ancestral Puebloans, as well as other indigenous peoples, carved petroglyphs that recorded celestial events. At Chaco Canyon, for instance, a carving of a hand and crescent is believed to depict a supernova that appeared in the year 1054, visible even in daylight. Sun daggers etched into stone align with solstices, marking seasonal cycles with remarkable accuracy. These were not idle decorations, but part of a sophisticated cultural astronomy deeply tied to agriculture, ceremony, and timekeeping. Yet the quirky stories of frontier days often strayed beyond science. Miners in Utah told of carvings that matched constellations not usually visible in the northern hemisphere, as if mapping skies from another world. Cowboys claimed that some petroglyphs glowed faintly at night, catching moonlight in a way that made the stars themselves flicker on stone. One prospector swore that a carving he found included a falling star with a tail, a detail he linked to comets he had seen in his lifetime. Others whispered that the carvings changed subtly between visits, as if the stars were still moving in stone. Scholars still debate how much of this was exaggeration and how much reflected genuine observation. Were settlers simply misinterpreting indigenous symbols through their own astronomical lens? Or had they encountered carvings so accurate that they felt compelled to explain them as supernatural? Some historians suggest the stories reflect unease at finding scientific knowledge embedded in cultures settlers often dismissed as primitive. The carvings challenge those assumptions, revealing a sophistication that frontier minds struggle to reconcile. The rabbit hole widens with cross-cultural echoes. Navajo traditions describe constellations with rich narratives, coyote scattering stars across the sky, heroes immortalized in celestial form. Pueblo stories wove the movements of the heavens into cycles of life and ritual. To find these narratives etched in stone blurred the line between myth and science, faith and record. Scholars still debate whether certain carvings mark specific celestial events, eclipses, comets, meteor showers, or whether they are broader cosmological symbols. Even today, archaeologists and stargazers alike stand before these petroglyphs in awe. Alignments still function. At Fajardo Butte, sunlight pierces a spiral exactly at solstice, a prehistoric calendar still ticking in stone, yet mysteries remain. Some patterns resemble star clusters we cannot see now, leading some to speculate about atmospheric shifts or lost knowledge. Was it coincidence, imagination, or an insight we have yet to understand? The star carvings remind us that the Wild West was not only a place of dust and cattle, but also of sky-watching civilizations far older than frontier towns. For those who came later, the carvings were rabbit holes, maps, omens, puzzles carved into canyon walls. They whispered that the land itself remembered the stars, and that time on the frontier was measured not only by calendars, but by the turning of the heavens above. The silent massacre site, hundreds lost, no records survive. The West is littered with battlefields, their stories preserved in diaries, reports and monuments. But settlers also whispered of places where conflict had raged without official memory, where bones lay scattered, yet no ledger told whose blood had been spilled. One such site, deep in the plains, was known only as the Silent Massacre Ground. Travellers described coming upon fields where skulls and broken weapons lay half buried in grass, yet history held no name for the dead. Mainstream archaeology gives context. Countless skirmishes occurred between native nations, settlers, and soldiers that never made it into official reports. Disease, poor record keeping, or deliberate erasure left many conflicts undocumented. Excavations in parts of Kansas, Nebraska, and Montana have uncovered mass graves whose occupants remain unidentified, their stories erased by time or politics. The Silent Massacre site may have been one of these, a tragedy too small for the newspapers, too inconvenient for government reports, yet enormous for those who lived it. The quirky tales around the site, however, made it uncanny. Cowboys swore that horses refused to cross the field, shying away as though spooked by unseen forces. Ranchers described hearing the faint sound of drumming at dusk, though no one was there. One traveller told of waking to see figures in the tall grass, shadowy forms that vanished when approached. Others claimed the earth itself bore scars, patches of soil where no grass grew, as if the ground still remembered blood spilled upon it. Scholars still debate whether such accounts reflect genuine hauntings or the psychological impact of stumbling upon human remains in unexpected places. Some argue that stories of ghostly drums and restless horses arose from indigenous oral traditions, which often marked battlefields as sacred or dangerous ground. Others suggest the settlers invented ghost stories to mask their unease at violence that their own society had sometimes inflicted and then suppressed in memory. The absence of records, they note, was not always accidental. Silence was often deliberate. The rabbit hole deepens when we consider whose voices are missing. Indigenous histories often contain accounts of conflicts erased from settler records, battles remembered in song or ceremony but absent from archives. Some scholars argue that silent massacre sites may be places where indigenous oral tradition preserves memory while written history turns away. Others counter that some were simply natural bone beds, ancient bison kills mistaken for human tragedy. The debate remains unresolved, suspended between archaeology and story. Even today, hikers and ranchers occasionally stumble upon lone arrowheads, rusted bullets, or bones in the soil. Sometimes these finds are catalogued, sometimes quietly reburied. Standing in such a place, one feels the uncanny weight of absence. A battle clearly happened, yet no one wrote it down. The silence becomes louder than any record. The silent massacre site reminds us that history is not only what survives, but also what is erased. For every well-documented skirmish, there were others swallowed by time, politics, or willful forgetting. And in those unmarked fields, the West still whispers, not through archives, but through bones, grass, and stories that refuse to vanish. The Canyon of Drums, walls that boomed like war signals. In the echoing gorges of the American West, sound behaved strangely. Some canyons amplified footsteps into rolling thunder, while others carried whispers for impossible distances. Yet one place became infamous among cowboys and prospectors, the Canyon of Drums, where every noise, from a clap of hands to the strike of a hoof, reverberated as if dozens of drums pounded in unison. Travellers swore the sound was so powerful it rattled the chest, like standing inside a war march. Mainstream geology explains that certain canyons act as natural resonators. Narrow walls, shaped by centuries of water and wind, can trap and bounce sound waves, layering them until they multiply. The sandstone of Utah and Arizona is especially known for its acoustic oddities, producing booms and hums far louder than the original sound. To early explorers unfamiliar with these effects, such canyons must have felt alive, as though the land itself were playing an instrument. The quirky details, however, elevated the canyon from curiosity to legend. Cowboys claimed that the booms sometimes began without any trigger, rolling like drums deep in the earth. A group of settlers once reported hearing rhythms too regular to be natural, patterns like signals echoing as if announcing war. Navajo herders told of nights when the canyon beat like a heartbeat, growing louder until dawn. One prospector swore he heard voices woven into the booms, a chant carried in stone. Scholars still debate whether these stories were exaggerations of real acoustics or something else entirely. Could strong winds have created percussive sounds mistaken for drumming? Could falling rocks or shifting ground create rhythms that seemed deliberate? Or did settlers, unnerved by the unfamiliar, interpret ordinary sounds through the imagery of war drums and ceremonies they half knew? Understood. Folklorists argue that the canyon stories reveal settler anxieties, fear of ambush, fear of being surrounded, transposed onto the land itself. The rabbit hole deepens when indigenous traditions are considered. For some Navajo and Pueblo peoples, sound was not separate from place but part of its spirit. Certain canyons were said to sing or speak, voices of holy beings resonating through stone. The drum-like echoes may have been understood as sacred messages, not threats. Scholars still debate whether settlers distorted these meanings into ominous tales, reinterpreting spiritual resonance as warning of violence. Even today, visitors to certain desert canyons can experience booming echoes, unlike anything in ordinary landscapes. A clap of the hands becomes a rolling drumbeat, swelling as though the earth has joined in. Standing there, surrounded by towering red walls, it is easy to understand why earlier travelers felt the canyon was alive, beating out signals for those who dared to listen. The Canyon of Drums reminds us that the Wild West was not only a land of visual spectacle, but of sound, strange, haunting, and at times overwhelming. Where settlers expected silence, the earth answered with music of its own. Whether as natural resonance, spiritual voice, or frontier omen, the drums of the canyon turned landscape into instrument, echoing a truth as old as time, that the land itself could speak. The brass-eyed stranger, a traveller remembered, yet never found again. On the dusty trails of the frontier, strangers were common, drifters, traders, preachers, and fortune-seekers passing through with little more than a name and a story. Yet among them, tales lingered of one who was different, a man whose eyes gleamed like brass in sunlight. Cowboys, ranchers, and even townsfolk claimed to have met him, always briefly, always at dusk. They remembered his gaze as metallic, reflecting firelight unnaturally, and yet no record of his existence could ever be confirmed. He became known in frontier lore as the brass-eyed stranger. Mainstream history acknowledges that memory often embellishes. Sun glare, dust, or even illness could make eyes appear unnatural. Some medical conditions, like cataracts or reflective scarring, can cause strange gleams. It is plausible that one or more real travellers had unusual eyes, remembered by many but confused in detail. Yet what makes the stranger extraordinary is how widespread the stories became. From Texas saloons to Colorado mining camps, people swore they had spoken with him, though their accounts never agreed on where he went next. The quirky tales sharpen the mystery. One prospector claimed the man knew details of his past no stranger could have guessed. A woman in Kansas said she saw the brass-eyed traveller step into her inn at dusk, only to vanish when she turned back with a meal. Cowboys told of following his tracks into open prairie, only to find them ending abruptly as though he had dissolved into the earth. Most unsettling of all were stories that he never aged. Men decades apart described him the same way, tall and lean, brass eyes catching firelight. Scholars still debate what such stories reveal. Was the stranger a composite figure, created when frontier travellers retold encounters with peculiar men until they fused into a single myth? Or does he reflect a deeper archetype, the uncanny visitor, half human and half symbol, who appears in lonely places across cultures? Some argue the brass eyes may reflect indigenous stories of spirit beings who walked the earth in human guise, retold by settlers in their own imagery. Others suggest he was a hoax, an eccentric man who cultivated his legend and let rumour carry it across the West. The rabbit hole deepens with one recurring motif. The stranger always spoke of journeys. He asked about roads, rivers, mountains, seeking not gold or shelter, but direction. Some versions say he warned travellers away from storms or danger, appearing just in time to save them. Others insist he led men astray, pointing toward trails that ended in disaster. Was he a guide, a trickster, or a mirage shaped by desperate need? Scholars still debate whether the legend reflects real encounters or the human desire for mysterious guardians and foes on the road. Even today, the story persists in certain rural towns. A handful of modern travellers claim to have met men with strange gleaming eyes, remembered only later when hearing the old tale. Whether by coincidence, memory's tricks, or something stranger, the brass-eyed stranger still walks the West in story, if not in flesh. The legend reminds us that the frontier was not only populated by sheriffs, outlaws, and settlers, but also by figures who slipped between fact and myth. In the brass gleam of those eyes, people saw something they could never quite explain, an echo of the uncanny wandering across an already uncertain land. The glass-eyed horse, an animal said to see the unseen. Among all the creatures of the Wild West, none carried as much weight as the horse. They were companions, lifelines, and sometimes the only difference between survival and death. Yet cowboys and settlers told of one animal unlike any other, a pale horse with eyes that glimmered like glass. Its gaze, they swore, was not just reflective but penetrating, as though it could see what no man could. The glass-eyed horse became a legend of the frontier, both feared and revered. Mainstream accounts recognized that unusual horses did exist. Blindness, cataracts, or unique coloration in the iris can make eyes appear clouded or luminous. White or albino horses sometimes bore pinkish, reflective eyes that startled the unaccustomed. In dim lamplight, they could gleam eerily, convincing observers they were something otherworldly. For cowboys raised on hardship and law, such a sight easily took on supernatural significance. The quirky details, though, made this horse far more than an oddity. Cowboys said the animal refused to cross certain places, old battlefields, abandoned camps, or shallow graves, rearing violently until led away. Some claimed the horse would stop dead on open prairie, staring into emptiness as if watching unseen riders pass by. In one famous tale, a ranch hand swore the horse saved his life by balking at a canyon rim moments before the ground collapsed. Others whispered darker stories, that men who tried to own the glass-eyed horse met misfortune, as though cursed by its uncanny vision. Scholars still debate what these accounts mean. Was the horse truly extraordinary, or did its behaviour simply reflect heightened instincts? Animals often sense danger before humans, storms, predators, unstable ground. Perhaps its unusual eyes only magnified ordinary horse behaviour into myth. Others argue that the story briefly seats settler fascination with the uncanny, an animal that blurred the line between nature and spirit. Some even suggest indigenous traditions of spirit animals capable of guiding or warning humans were recast into the image of the glass-eyed mount. The rabbit hole widens when one considers the horse's role in frontier imagination. To the Comanche, Lakota, and other nations, horses were sacred beings, companions in both life and spirit journeys. A horse with extraordinary eyes might have been seen as a messenger, a bridge between worlds. Settlers, hearing such interpretations, may have retold them in their own idiom, stripping spiritual nuance into ghost stories. Scholars still debate whether the glass-eyed horse is purely invention or a distorted echo of older traditions. Even today, ranchers occasionally describe animals with eyes that seem to glow unnaturally in certain light. Veterinary science explains the effect, but folklore often lingers. A white horse with pale eyes, standing alone at dusk, still carries an aura of strangeness, and if it pauses suddenly, ears pricked at something unseen, the old stories stir again. The glass-eyed horse reminds us that the frontier was not only about human legends, but also about the animals who carried them. In its gleaming eyes, men saw protection, omen, or curse. Whether natural or supernatural, the horse became more than an animal. It became a mirror for the fears and hopes of those who rode the endless plains, the vanishing homestead, farmhouses that dissolved into thin air. The West was dotted with homesteads, lonely cabins built from sod, timber, or stone, planted like fragile seeds against an unforgiving land. Some endured for generations, while others collapsed into ruin. Yet stories spread of homesteads that did more than fail. Travellers swore they came upon sturdy houses in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys, only to find emptiness when they arrived. These were the vanishing homesteads, buildings that seemed to dissolve into thin air, leaving no trace but unease. Mainstream history explains that illusions were common on the prairie. Mirage effects, caused by heat shimmering off flat land, could make distant trees or structures appear where none existed. Settlers might also mistake abandoned ruins glimpsed at twilight for occupied cabins, only to find them empty. In some cases, homesteads were indeed deserted suddenly, victims of drought, disease, or debt, gone before neighbours even knew. By the time travellers arrived, silence and weeds gave the impression of sudden disappearance. But the quirky tales painted stranger pictures. A wagon train reportedly saw a small farm, complete with corral and livestock, and chose to camp nearby. Yet in the morning the homestead was gone, the land bare and untouched. A mail rider swore he visited a family one evening, shared a meal, and when he returned weeks later, no cabin remained and no neighbours remembered them. Cowboys told of riding past lit windows at night, only to circle back and find darkness on open grass. Some swore that the buildings themselves simply folded into the earth. Scholars still debate what lies at the root of these stories. Were they mirages compounded by exhaustion and fear? Or do they reflect memory itself failing, confused accounts of places half remembered, projected into landscapes that no longer matched? Folklorists note parallels with European ghost stories of phantom houses, suggesting that settlers carried old world legends into new soil. Others suggest indigenous stories of spirit lodges, sacred spaces that appeared and disappeared, may have inspired the tales. The rabbit hole deepens with speculation about real vanishings. Frontier records tell of families who abandoned claims overnight, leaving food on tables and tools outside. Some left to escape debt collectors, others fled storms or violence. In later retellings, these abrupt departures blurred into myths of houses themselves disappearing. Scholars still debate whether such vanishings were exaggerated cover-ups for ordinary tragedy, or whether some places truly felt cursed enough to drive families out without warning. Even today, hikers in remote parts of the plains sometimes report glimpsing structures in the distance that vanish when approached. Empty foundations, half swallowed by grass, add to the sense of haunting. Photographers capture lonely chimneys or door frames, standing in fields with no other trace, eerie monuments to forgotten homes. In such places, the old legends breathe again. The vanishing homestead reminds us that the West was never as solid as it appeared. Families came and went, fortunes rose and fell, and even houses, symbols of permanence, proved fragile against time, weather, and imagination. On the frontier, to see a home dissolve was to confront the truth. That settlement itself was an experiment, always at risk of vanishing into the vastness of the land. The frozen rider, a body preserved in ice for decades. In the high country of the Rockies, winter ruled with a merciless hand. Snowdrifts swallowed cabins, and avalanches erased trails in an instant. Among these dangers, one tale stands apart, the story of a rider found encased in ice, his body perfectly preserved as if caught mid-journey. Cowboys and mountaineers whispered of the frozen rider, discovered decades after he had set out, his horse and gear sealed beside him in a glacial tomb. Mainstream history admits that frozen remains are not unheard of. In the Rockies, sudden blizzards and deep crevasses sometimes trapped travellers, preserving their bodies in cold storage until thaw or accident revealed them. In Colorado and Montana, stories of long-lost hunters or trappers found intact in glaciers have surfaced periodically, often with gear remarkably well preserved. To frontier settlers, unaccustomed to such finds, these frozen figures seemed like time travellers, faces from another era staring back through glassy ice. The quirky details gave the legend an almost mythical edge. Some said the rider's eyes were still open, clear and unclouded, as though watching those who found him. Others swore his pocket watch still ticked faintly beneath the ice, never wound but never stopping. In one tale, a group of miners uncovered the rider in summer thaw, only to see his body vanish again under a sudden storm, reclaimed by snow as if the mountain refused to let him go. Another version claimed that the horse too was intact, its mane stiff with frost, its hooves frozen mid-step. Scholars still debate how much truth lies in these tales. Were the stories exaggerated reports of genuine finds, bodies preserved for months or years, stretched in retelling to decades? Or do they reflect a deeper cultural need to imagine the frontier as a place where time itself froze, suspending be? Uth man and beast in eternal struggle. Some argue that indigenous stories of ice spirits or sleeping warriors in the mountains may have influenced settlers' interpretations, reframing natural preservation as supernatural defiance of death. The rabbit hole deepens with accounts of what happened after discovery. Some claimed the frozen rider was removed and displayed in a nearby town, drawing crowds before mysteriously vanishing again. Others insisted the body was left untouched, a warning to travellers that the mountain keeps what it takes. A handful of stories even suggest that multiple frozen bodies were found in different locations, each retold as the Frozen Rider, multiplying one legend into many. Scholars still debate whether this diffusion points to myth-making or to a real, recurring phenomenon of ice preserving the lost. Even today, glaciers across the Rockies occasionally yield relics, boots, tools, even bones from long-dead mountaineers and pioneers. When such finds emerge, the old whispers stir again. Was this another frozen rider, caught mid-journey, suspended between past and present? Standing at the edge of a glacier, with wind shrieking across ice and stone, it is easy to believe the mountains still hold travellers in their grip, waiting to release them centuries later. The Frozen Rider reminds us that the frontier was not only vast but timeless. In its icy vaults, the West kept memories unspoiled, faces locked in crystal, journeys unfinished yet preserved. For those who found him, the rider was both tragedy and miracle, a man who had not aged, staring through the glass of history, still astride the road he never finished. The bells at midnight, chimes from a church long buried. Frontier towns rose quickly and often fell just as fast. A saloon might last a decade, a church perhaps longer. But in the deserts of the southwest, stories grew of bells that continued to toll long after the churches that housed them had crumbled or sunk beneath sand. Travellers at midnight swore they heard the clear peal of bronze drifting across the empty land, though no steeple stood within miles. They called it the bells at midnight, a sound both comforting and unsettling. Mainstream history gives clues. Many Spanish missions and frontier chapels were abandoned in the 18th and 19th centuries, their bells removed, stolen, or lost to time. Some bells were buried to protect them from raiders or melted for scrap. Yet, reports of bells ringing where no bell tower remained persisted. Acoustics may explain some cases. Distant sounds carried across plains can seem closer than they are, and echoes in canyon country can distort sources. To tired riders or isolated homesteaders, the faint chime of wind through metal could easily be mistaken for a church bell. But the quirky stories go further. Cowboys on the trail swore the bells tolled precisely at midnight, never earlier, never later. One prospector claimed he followed the sound for hours, only to end at a patch of sand where no structure stood. A widow in New Mexico told neighbours she heard bells each year on the anniversary of her husband's death, always faint and solemn, drifting through her window. Others said the chimes warned of storms, beginning hours before thunder rolled across the land. Scholars still debate whether the bells were purely imagined, or whether remnants of real churches lay buried beneath dunes and riverbeds. Could underground caverns, filled with scrap iron or rusted machinery, create resonant sounds in windstorms? Were settlers unknowingly interpreting indigenous ceremonies, drums, chants, flutes, as familiar church bells reshaped by memory and longing? Some argue the stories reveal a deeper yearning. Settlers, far from home, wished to hear the sound of faith anchoring them in a strange land, and so the bells rang in their minds. The rabbit hole deepens when treasure lore enters, tales of buried mission bells, bronze cast in Spain, carried across the ocean, lost in the desert, abound in frontier myth. Some treasure hunters spent lifetimes seeking them, convinced the bells at midnight were not spirits but signals from underground caches. None have been definitively recovered. Scholars still debate whether the legends conceal kernels of truth or are inventions designed to lure fortune seekers deeper into barren lands. Even today, desert travelers sometimes report phantom sounds at night, wind rushing through canyons that mimic tones, metal fence wires humming like gongs. Paranormal enthusiasts flock to ruins in New Mexico and Arizona, hoping to hear the bells at midnight for themselves. Whether they succeed or not, the expectation alone makes the silence ring. The bells at midnight remind us that the West was as much about sound as sight, about the echoes of what once was, still carried on air. Whether real bronze hidden beneath the sand or memory made audible, the bells toll not only for the faithful but for all who wander, reminding them that time itself has a way of keeping watch. The drowned desert camp. Flash flood erased all trace of men. The desert often tricks the unprepared. By day it bakes with relentless sun, by night it freezes, and on rare occasions it drowns. Cowboys and prospectors told of one such disaster, a camp swallowed whole by a sudden wall of water. Tents, wagons, men and animals, all gone within minutes, washed away without a trace. Locals called it the drowned desert camp, a ghost story retold whenever storms gathered over arid ground. Mainstream history confirms the danger. Flash floods are among the deadliest desert hazards, particularly in Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. Dry washes, arroyos that look harmless, can become raging torrents when rain falls miles away. Entire camps have been swept down valleys, their remains buried under mud and boulders. Even seasoned settlers sometimes underestimated these forces, pitching camp in low ground that turned into rivers overnight. Reports in the late 1800s document several such tragedies, though details are sparse. The quirky tales made the event more mysterious. Survivors claimed the flood came not with rain, but under clear skies, as if conjured from nowhere. One prospector swore the torrent carried not just water, but uprooted trees and boulders the size of cabins, grinding everything to pieces. Another tale insisted that when search parties returned days later, they found no debris, no tools, not even wagon wheels, just bare sand, smooth as if nothing had ever been there. Cowboys whispered that the camp had been swallowed, erased by more than water. Scholars still debate the meaning behind such accounts. Did storms miles upstream unleash floods upon unsuspecting camps, giving the impression of water summoned from empty skies? Were reports of vanishing debris exaggerated, or do they reflect the desert's uncanny ability to hide evidence beneath shifting sand? Some historians argue that stories of drowned camps became cautionary tales, warnings to greenhorns to respect the desert's hidden dangers. Others suggest the myths reflect guilt, survivors trying to make sense of companions lost too quickly for mourning. The rabbit hole grows deeper when we consider cultural memory. Indigenous stories across the Southwest often warn against camping in dry riverbeds, describing floods as the land's way of cleansing itself. Settlers, unfamiliar with this wisdom, may have ignored the warnings, transforming natural disaster into mystery. Scholars still debate whether the drowned desert camp was a single real event retold in many places, or a legend stitched together from countless tragedies. Even today, the desert shows its dual face. Hikers and campers sometimes encounter sudden torrents ripping through canyons, water churning with rocks and branches, gone as quickly as it came. In the aftermath, the ground often looks eerily untouched, smooth sand, as if the flood took everything with it. For those who remember the old stories, the silence afterward feels like confirmation. The desert keeps no witnesses. The drowned desert camp reminds us that the Wild West was not only shaped by human ambition, but also by the raw power of nature. Towns could be abandoned, mines exhausted, fortunes lost, but in the desert, an entire community could vanish overnight, erased as cleanly as chalk washed from a slate. The land itself became a witness that refused to speak, leaving only stories to fill the silence. The Black Cross Mine, a shaft sealed after strange voices rose. The mining boom of the Wild West carved scars into mountains, chasing veins of silver, gold, and copper deep underground. Yet among the countless shafts dug by desperate men, one earned a reputation darker than most. Known as the Black Cross Mine, it was said to have been sealed not because it was exhausted, but because something within it spoke. Miners told of strange voices rising from the depths, echoes that no man claimed as his own. Mainstream mining history admits that dangerous sounds often haunted shafts. Groaning timbers, shifting rock, and the drip of water could mimic whispers in the dark. Methane or bad air, common in poorly ventilated tunnels, could cause dizziness, hallucinations, even voices heard by men half suffocated. Sealing a mine was sometimes necessary to prevent deaths, and crosses painted black or white were a common warning to keep men out. In that sense, the Black Cross Mine could have been an ordinary site, abandoned for safety. But the quirky details made it extraordinary. Miners swore the voices spoke in languages none of them knew, chanting like a choir deep beneath the rock. One man claimed the echoes answered questions he muttered, always in a tone mocking his own. Another insisted he heard the voices of dead comrades, calling his name from below. A foreman reportedly collapsed after hearing his child's laughter echo from the shaft, though the boy was hundreds of miles away. When the mine was finally sealed, locals said they still heard murmurs through the boards on windless nights. Scholars still debate whether the mine's reputation reflects psychology, geology, or something stranger. Were exhausted, frightened men succumbing to auditory hallucinations in the dark? Or did the shape of the mine truly create acoustics uncanny enough to simulate voices, folklorists argue? That such stories reflect miners' fear of the earth itself, a reminder that they were trespassers in a realm older than humanity. Others suggest indigenous traditions of sacred mountains may have been unconsciously woven into the tale, the mine becoming a place where spirits punished intrusion. The rabbit hole grows deeper with rumours of what lay sealed within. Some said the mine struck not ore, but a cavern filled with strange formations that hummed when touched. Others whispered of artifacts uncovered, idols, carvings, relics, quickly reburied when the voices began. Treasure hunters in later decades claimed the Black Cross marked not danger, but secret wealth, hidden by companies unwilling to admit what they'd found. Scholars still debate whether the stories conceal a real discovery, or whether the mine was only ever an ordinary shaft, its legend inflated by fear. Even today, in remote corners of Nevada and Arizona, boarded shafts still bear faded crosses. Adventurers sometimes pry at the timbers, hoping to find veins of silver or the echo of forgotten voices. Most hear only wind, yet those who linger long enough often describe unease, the sense of whispers just beyond hearing, carried not by air, but by the rock itself. The Black Cross Mine reminds us that the West was not only about riches pulled from the ground, but also about the dangers hidden beneath. Some mines yielded fortune, others collapse, but in a few, like this one, what rose from the depths was stranger than awe. Whether tricks of sound, fractured memory, or something truly uncanny, the voices remain sealed in legend, waiting in the dark where no light dares follow. Conclusion: The Wild West is often remembered through familiar images: cowboys on horseback, saloons bustling, railroads stretching toward the horizon. Yet beneath those images lies a deeper, stranger frontier, a land alive with rabbit holes of history and myth. From bones that rose out of prairie soil to voices rumoured in sealed mines, from rivers that burned to lights that walked, these stories reveal a West that was never simple or empty. It was a crossroads of geology, folklore, memory, and imagination. Some mysteries can be explained: iron oxide bleeding from stone, echoes bouncing in canyons, floods erasing camps overnight. Others remain stubbornly unresolved, lingering in the twilight between fact and legend. What endures is the sense of awe that the land itself carried stories, some written in rock, others whispered in wind. And perhaps the truest legacy of the West is that it still leaves us listening for echoes long after the voices have gone.